All right, how are we doing tonight, y'all?
Good.
Hey, it's good to hear. Thank you. Thank you for the feedback. Y'all, I'm so excited to finally be back up here talking to y'all again. Please forgive me if I sound a little weird tonight. I'm still getting over a sickness, some flu, something that I had over the weekend. I'm going to do my best not to just completely cough into the microphone all night. You ever wonder what it was like for Jesus' family growing up? You ever think about that? Ever cross your mind? Because you got to wonder, right? We know Jesus had a family, but we don't really get to hear much about it in the Bible. And I sometimes just wonder, how annoying would it be to have Jesus as your brother? I know that sounds like a little sacrilegious. I can hear the silence. You're afraid to laugh at that. But really think about it, right? How many of y'all have a sibling that maybe gets more attention or special treatment from your parents? You don't have to raise your hand if the sibling is in the room. You can just blink twice at me, right? Okay, so now imagine that is Jesus. All right? How many of y'all knew that Jesus had brothers? He did. He had 4 of them. You had no idea because they're not Jesus. Completely overshadowed, right? Really, imagine this, right? Who forgot to take out the trash? Not Jesus. Who forgot his parents' birthday? Not Jesus. Why does Jesus get less chores than everybody else? Well, he's literally going to die for all of our sins one day, so we're just going to cut him a little bit of slack right now, right? That's tough, dude. That would be a tough family to grow up in. It's definitely a unique family situation. I also had a bit of a unique family situation growing up. We got a picture of him if you want to put that up. Now, I don't know if you can tell. It takes a very keen-eyed viewer to spot what's different about my family. It is, of course, that I have an identical twin. No, I've got 4 brothers who are all adopted. They're not in order in the picture, but in order. I've got this speech down stat. That's Cameron. He's 11 months older than I am. He was adopted from Vietnam when he was 10 months old. I was -1 month old. That's Noah. We adopted him from Vietnam when he was 3. I was 6. That's Johnny and Lisandro. We adopted them when they were 12 and 13. I was 16 in high school. They're from Colombia. No, none of them were brothers before we adopted them. And no, I am not also adopted. This is usually the part in the conversation where they say something like, oh, so you're the real kid. And then I have to explain to them, why that's a really messed up thing to say, right? And I love my brothers more than anything. They are so awesome. We talk to each other all the time. We game together all the time. I am the luckiest brother in the world. But as you can imagine, there are some unique challenges that come with adoption. All of my brothers came from very difficult backgrounds. Johnny and Lisandro, who were much older when we adopted them, had a really difficult time adjusting to American culture. But then there was other stuff, deeper stuff that we didn't even really talk about out loud. I remember when I was a kid and me and my brothers would be roasting each other, as brothers do. One of the lines that they would always use to just completely instant win the roast sesh was, oh yeah? Well, Mom and Dad chose us. They just got stuck with you. Right? How do you come back from that? How do you recover? You can't. There's no way to win after that. And even though they always said it jokingly, I think it kind of touched upon this fear that we had but never really talked about of do Mom and Dad love us all equally? Right? We never talked about it. We know deep down that they did, but that was just one of those things that we had to navigate through with our family situation. And as cheesy as it sounds, I used to wonder right? Because I was like a good church kid growing up. I was always asking, like, what would Jesus do, right? So I would ask myself, like, what would Jesus do in this situation? What would Jesus do if he had adopted siblings? And you probably have your own questions, right, about your own family. Like, what would Jesus do if my parents didn't love each other? What would Jesus do if I didn't grow up with my parents? If he was the one having to, like, raise his siblings, if someone in his family had disability, right? Like, there's as many questions as there are families. But as we continue our series on what would Jesus do, and as we talk tonight about families, I kind of want to focus all these questions that we might have about our families into one. What would Jesus do about my family? About your weird family, right? Bible doesn't really tell us a whole lot about Jesus' family situation growing up. But what it does tell us a lot about is Jesus himself. And the whole point of this series is the recognition that even though the Bible doesn't always speak to these specific situations in our lives, the more that we learn about Jesus, the more we become like Jesus, the better our relationships are going to be all around. And that is especially true with our family. And so tonight I want to look at a passage that comes from the Sermon on the Mount. This is a very famous couple of chapters in the Bible. It's this big speech that Jesus gives at the beginning of his ministry where he's basically outlining, like, hey, this is what I'm about, this is what my mission is about, and this is how I want my followers to live. So, like, pretty important stuff, right? And this is a passage that some of y'all might be familiar with. It's very popular these days, right? Where Jesus is talking about judging others, and he has this to say. Why do you see the splinter that's in your brother's or sister's eye, but you don't notice the log in your own eye? How can you say to your brother or sister, let me take the splinter out of your eye, when there is a log in your eye? You deceive yourself. First take the log out of your eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's or sister's eye. And I love this passage for a couple of reasons. The first being that this is just like an absolutely hilarious like image, right? Like, let me just here. Really, like, imagine if you were just walking around the street and you saw somebody with just this sticking out of their face. Right? Like, you call their name, they turn around too fast, boom, they're handing out concussions, right? Like, this person is not safe to be around. And also just, like, imagine, like, the neck strength that would take, right? Like, dude would just be all neck. It'd be crazy. And the message to this is, like, pretty obvious, right? Like, judging others is ridiculous when we ourselves are imperfect people. And so you're probably thinking, like, okay, Josh, I get it. Like, don't judge my family for all the weird stuff they do. And, like, yeah, maybe don't do that. But I think that Jesus is telling us more than just don't judge. And I want to be very clear here, right? There are some things that your family might do that are not okay. Right? Cheating is not okay. Abuse is not okay. Those are serious things. And if someone in your family is hurting you, I hope that you know that you can come to one of us on staff so that we can walk through that with you. And so I just want to be very clear, like, what I'm about to say, we're not talking about those situations. We're talking about all the other stuff that we judge our families for. And we do judge our families. I think we tend to judge our families way more sometimes than we do other people. And I think one of the things that Jesus is trying to show us in this passage is where that judgment tends to come from, right? Like, Why does Jesus use so much imagery about like eyes and sight in this passage? If you see, I highlighted, like Jesus mentions eyes or sight, seeing, something like that 8 times in 3 verses. That's a lot. And I think the reason like Jesus is doing this is to show us that judgment comes from a place of not seeing ourselves or others clearly, right? Like we think that we are in a place to judge others because we don't see, or let's be honest, we don't want to see, the stuff that we do that is just as bad or maybe worse, right? And we're not seeing others clearly. We automatically assume the worst, and then that's just all people are to us when we're judging them. I'll give you an example. So I remember this one time when I was in high school. I drove this absolutely beautiful Ford F-150 that I got from my grandpa. This thing was older than I was. I named it Fiona because we wanted a name that started with F, and it was green. And so obviously we took inspiration from Shrek, and we named it Fiona. Would have been 29 today, rip. This thing was incredible, right? Like no AC half the time, hand-cranked windows, like an absolute mess. I loved it. And I remember there was one day where I can't remember why, like I was just like having a terrible day in general, right? Like I don't know if I like bombed a test, if I like got rejected by a girl or something. I was just like not having a good time. And so I'm driving home, and something really weird happened. It was like every 10 seconds, somebody behind me was blaring their horn at me. Like I could not go a block without somebody blaring their horn. And at first I was like very scared, and I was like, am I going too slow? Like, do I not have my blinkers on, right? And then about like the 7th or 8th time that somebody was honking at me, I started getting a little annoyed. And I'm just gonna be like really like vulnerable and honest with y'all here for a second. I used to have terrible road rage issues when I was a kid. Like, imagine like all the stuff you see on TikTok, like that was me. God has thankfully sanctified me in that area. God had not yet done it at that point, right? And so I'm like a block away from my house. I'm at the light turning into my neighborhood, and this car behind me honks again, and I absolutely lose my mind. And when they pull up next to me, they just see this feral teenager just going absolutely, just unloading on them. I don't even know if they heard half the stuff I said. I hope they didn't, right? But it was bad. It was bad, y'all. And then I finally get home, and my dad's outside. He was like doing yard work, and he came over to greet me, welcome me home. And then my dad goes, hey, who wrote that on the back of your car? Did one of your friends do that? And I was like, what are you talking about? It's like, you did, come look. And so I went and I looked at the back of my car, and to my absolute horror, I realized that somebody had wrote, honk if you love Jesus, on the back of my car without me noticing. And so I'm sitting here like horrified, so embarrassed with myself, right? Like whoever that person was who was behind me, in their head, they were just like, I love Jesus, honk, honk. And then they pull up next to me, expecting me to be like, hello, my brother in Christ. And instead they just see like this terrifying, like feral teenager about to like leap out the window at them. They didn't deserve that. They didn't deserve that. But like, I was judging all of these people who are honking at me, right? Because I was not seeing the situation clearly. There was something about myself, or at least, my car in this situation, that was causing people to react to me that I did not realize. But I was also not seeing other people clearly. At no point was I like this is an improbable amount of honking happening. Maybe there's more going on here than people just trying to ruin my day. No, I just automatically assume, like, these people are jerks, and I'm just going to give them what's coming to them, right? We judge others because we don't see them or ourselves clearly. And often we are the most judgmental about our own families because there's a coffin. It's already started. Kind of counterintuitively, the people closest to us are the ones who are hardest to see clearly. Because we're the ones who see all the messiness and all the weirdness that nobody else does, and we're comparing them to like the public image of everybody else's families, right? We spend so much time with them that in a weird way we don't actually get to know our family. We just assume we know what's going through their head when most of the time we don't. And here Jesus is calling us to recognize that about ourselves, to recognize that we don't always know what's going on with everybody around us, right? How many times have you done something stupid and then one of your parents asks you, why did you do that? And your answer is, I have no idea. But be honest, how many of y'all have had that conversation with your parents, right? I know you have because I was a teenager once. And I believe you, right? Genuinely, I would do something stupid and have no idea why I did it. But it's crazy to me, we think we know why everybody else is doing what they're doing. We don't even know why we do what we do sometimes, right? When we judge others, it shuts down any chance to understand, to empathize. We just stick with our worst assumption, and that's all we see. And until we take the log out of our eye, right, until we deal with all this business, there's no way to make that quiet. Until we are willing to see, to make the effort to see others clearly, all we're going to do is judge, and we won't be able to understand or to accept our family. And I think that this is really what is at the heart of this passage, right? Jesus is calling us to do more than just not judge others, right? That's actually pretty easy, just ignore them, Jesus is calling us instead to understand and to accept our family. And I know that you guys understand how important this is because y'all tell us all the time about how frustrating and hurtful it is when your parents don't understand you, or when your siblings don't understand you. You know how hard it is when your parents just assume that you're lazy because you forgot to do one of your chores, right? Or they just assume that you're irresponsible because you did bad on a test. Right? We know how important it is, how much it matters to be seen for who we are and to just be understood. So why don't we do that with our families? I want to be clear here, right? This doesn't mean that we have to be okay with everything that our family does. This doesn't mean that we have to agree with everything our family does. But what it does mean is that when we see our family as people made in God's image, we are able to recognize that they are just as broken and messed up as we are, and therefore as much in need of grace as we are, right? To treat them the way that we wish they were treating us. When we see our family clearly, it makes room in our hearts to have grace and understanding and even gratitude. I'll kind of end on this illustration. I remember there was one time when I have a great relationship with my mom, right? I want to make that very clear. She is a queen. Ask the people on staff. Like, I talk about my mom and how incredible she is all the time. This was not always the case. I used to have a very tough relationship with my mom. It got to a point at one point where I was considering going like low or no contact with them, and it's because my mom had this kind of tendency to blow up at times, right? And we never knew like what would cause that to happen, right? We kind of walked on eggshells a lot of the time around our house. And there was this one time after I graduated from college where I was down in Houston. This was like during the Big Freeze. Do y'all remember like the first Snowmageddon, right? Y'all remember that? Okay, so it was like days before the snowpocalypse was happening. And there was one of my friends who was living out of the country at the time, had flown in. He was going to be in Dallas for like 3 days, and then he was going to be like out of the country again for another year. And I really, really wanted to see him again before that happened. So I knew that like the end of the world was coming, and I was like, you know what? We're making the drive anyways. And my mom and I got into this huge fight over it. She did not want me to go. We argued about it. She said things to me that like I can't repeat at church. It was honestly like very painful. But I end up going, I see my friend, I'm driving back, literally like the snow was like following me as I was driving back down to Dallas. You know, I was like racing against the clock kind of deal. My mom was probably correct in telling me that I was dumb for doing that, but here we are. I lived. And when I got back, I sat down with my mom, and I asked her, like, how could you say those things to me? And that was, like, not something I'd ever really done before. Every time you just kind of, like, we didn't talk about it afterwards. And for the first time, I was like, how could you say that to me? And my mom immediately broke down crying. And as we continued to talk, what I came to learn is that my mom had been abused growing up. I didn't know this. I knew that she had had a difficult childhood. I did not realize how severe it was. And what my mom told us is that she constantly feared for me and my brother's safety because she had never experienced safety when she was growing up. And that all those times where she had like kind of like lost it on us, it wasn't coming out of like anger or hatred or disappointment. It was just fear. And that didn't suddenly make everything okay, right? Like what she said wasn't okay. But for the first time, I was able to understand why. For the first time, I kind of saw clearly who my mom was and why she acted the way she did sometimes. And it allowed me, honestly, to have more gratitude for all the things that she did right growing up, despite what she had gone through. And it allowed me to have grace for her in those moments where she did mess up. And I think that that is what Jesus is calling us to do here, right? Accepting our family means that we recognize that they are people who have all the same fears and struggles that we do. And to show them the same grace that God shows us. Let's pray.